like Jesus, and who spoke Aramaic and probably Greek, and Paul and the others of his generation that spoke and wrote Koine Greek. So we would not be having sessions about Anabaptism today, because we would have been right there and would have understood in like the first hearers. But when you're 2,000 years later and like culturally far removed from an Eastern culture to a Western culture or a Hellenistic culture, from over an ocean, you're far, far away. You're really removed from where the Bible was written and the teachings were taught. So then we need sessions like this to try to put ourselves as best as we can into a place of understanding, to understand what the first hearers heard and thought when they heard Jesus teach and when they read the letters of Paul and the other apostles. So here we are today in the 21st century. So I'm going to several times today, I'll be using like the phrase the 21st century, and it's to compare with the first century. So, and the idea is for us to grasp this change in time and the effort it takes to put ourselves into the best position to understand what the first hearers heard. Okay, so this is actually... there's the clock. Okay, so this is actually number 3 of a 3-part series on Anabaptism. So and I want to commend you as a church and your church leaders and whoever all was involved in this series on Anabaptism. I want to commend you for the effort you have put into understanding who we are as a people and how it is that we live out our faith. So Anabaptism and its influence on us today was brought by Marcus Yoder on October 6th, and he had 2 sessions, I believe a morning and an evening session, best I could tell from the YouTube channel. And then historic faith, actually apostolic historic faith, and also the change of allegiance testimony by Dean and Tanya Taylor on October 13th, 2 sessions. I believe those were both morning sessions, the way it appeared. And now today, this topic on Anabaptism today, and ADC's vision to live out Anabaptism as a church, like two sessions there. So I want to, before we go on, I want to just emphasize again the blessing we have in this community of having scholars that understand Anabaptist history and theology, like Marcus Yoder and like Dean Taylor. Do you get, what a blessing it is to have brothers like this right here among us? And I just want to, again, I think both of them mentioned their books, but I just want to mention them again. Cathedrals, Castles, and Caves by The Origins of Anabaptist Faith by Marcus Yoder. So Marcus, I think, could have written a more scholarly version of this book, but he wrote this for the popular market. That's the way in which the academics concede that the rest of us need books written on a lower level so we understand it. And so this one is written for the popular market. And then also A Change of Allegiance, the story of Dean and Tanya Taylor's journey from the U.S. Army to Anabaptism. And so if you haven't read these books, they're available locally here, and so if you haven't read them, avail yourselves of them. And while I'm promoting books, I also want to mention this little one here by Harold S. Bender. It's the Anabaptist Vision. I'm going to quote from this later this morning, but this is actually an essay that Harold S. Bender delivered in, I think, 1944, which would have been during World War II. He delivered an essay or a speech to the American Society of Church History, I believe it was. And so this is the essay then in print version. But he captured the essence of the Anabaptist vision. And so I want to promote that as well. So for those of you that have taken the impact training that is offered by Rick Rhodes and Darrell Weaver, they always recommend that you start with an I am statement. So if you've taken that training, you'll know what an I am statement is. It's your inspiration and motivation for this sermon. And so I'm going to deliver one here this morning. Here's an overview of session 1. I'm going to take just a few minutes to go through the previous session highlights, and then a summary statement on historic Anabaptism. And then there are 3 questions that I want for us to grapple with. And I'm proposing that these are questions that are relevant today. And it's not just those in the evangelical church or our unchurched culture that are asking these questions. These are questions we are asking ourselves. Why do we even call ourselves Anabaptists today? The second question is Anabaptism worth continuing in the 21st century? And the third question, is Anabaptism the antidote for the angst of our age? I had a notion to call that like AAA, Anabaptist Antidote for Angst. But I ran out of room. The line was full. And then there's session 2 will be following this morning. By the way, thank you for accommodating our schedule and making this a 2-session morning rather than an evening session. I'll be covering there what is ADC, the Anabaptist Disciples of Christ, and from the perspective of making Anabaptism relevant today. So here's the inspiration and motivation. So this is kind of like the high-level overarching purpose for everything that's to follow. It's to understand that Anabaptism is a relevant way to live out biblical faith in the 21st century. So we see our churches as people of God with an Anabaptist antidote for the angst of our age. Okay, going to the highlights. So Marcus Yoder, and by the way, I think this is what was intended by this series, is that first Marcus Yoder came and gave kind of like he's an historian, so he gave kind of like a historical context for Anabaptism, and also I have a slide about the theology that he discussed as well. But so the Anabaptist movement, and by the way, let me say that movement is actually a meaningful term. That's one of the things I think Brother Judd mentioned about like starting churches. We are working to start a church planting movement. What is a movement? It's when you are wherever you're at, and maybe like 5 years later, you look back and you see that actually a large group of people have changed their trajectory. It's not a flash in the pan, one generation, one small group, one church, or one individual effort, but there's a vision that is cast among a group of people who come together and work together and bring change over time, so that when you look back, you'll see that we have changed. And the premise is that evangelism is essentially making disciples through planting churches. And we should not view mission work as something separate for this select few that are specially trained and equipped and go off and do mission work while the rest of us stay at home and don't do mission work. But it's actually how we together plant churches, make disciples, is how we evangelize and carry out the Great Commission that Jesus left for the church. So, the Anabaptist movement began, and I'll say this somewhat unplanned, on January 21 in 1525 in Zurich, Switzerland. And what I mean by somewhat unplanned is there was this evening, there were a number of disciples, if you will, of Ulrich Zwingli, who was preaching in Zurich at the Großmünster, like the main church in the city of Zurich. And they were discussing baptism, and so they agreed that having water poured on you as an infant is not an act of faith, and so they should be baptized upon their confession of faith. So when they brought this to Master Ulrich, he said, let's take that question to the village council, the city council. These men said, it's not a question for the council to decide, but it's a question for the Bible to rule on. And so they met that evening on January 21, 1525, in the home of Felix Manz's mother. And there, while they were discussing this, Conrad Grebel said, for the sake of my soul, will someone baptize me upon my confession of faith? So George Blaurock, who was kind of like the Peter among them, got up and baptized him, whereupon he said, would you baptize the rest of us? And so that evening, I think about 15, just about everyone that was present, maybe not quite. I think one woman, the rest were men, maybe one man was not baptized, but the rest were baptized. And so when they got up from their knees that evening, it's kind of like, okay, what are we now? We've taken a step where we are no longer part of the local church. And that's where, and there's a saying or a truism that you can read, you read here and there in Anabaptist history, that wherever men and women conform themselves to the image of Christ, there dwells the church of God. And that's what they decided that evening. And so out of that, there came the first Anabaptist congregation in nearby Zolliken, a village on the outskirts of Zurich. That church had about 35 members, give or take, from January through August of 1525 until it was broken up by persecution. But during that time, it spread like wildfire. So Marcus then also talked about the theology context and said that the essence of Christianity is discipleship. So let your minds go back. This is some of the things he said. The essence of Christianity is discipleship, following Jesus in radical trust, showing His love and peace, and rethinking how we relate to God, how we relate to the world, and how we relate to each other. And then he also said this: Menno Simons was a revolutionary, not a fussy old man devising rules to limit our relevance. That was actually my favorite line from his entire 2 sessions. Because I think we've kind of like come to understand like Menno Simons as this stodgy old theologian who sat in a corner and dreamed up things that were like rigid and made it like put you out of touch with the rest of your culture. He was a revolutionary in the truest sense of the word. Dean Taylor then spoke on October 13th, and he placed Anabaptism in a historical context as a 16th century expression of New Testament faith. I think that was the purpose of bringing him in here, to connect Anabaptism in the 1500s to the first generation of faith. By the way, I should also say that in church history like this, we sometimes confuse these terms. When we talk about the apostolic church, that means the church where the apostles were still there. Afterward, then we talk about the early church. After about 100 AD, when John, who was the last disciple to die, passed off the scene, thereafter it was the early church. But up through that time, the apostolic church. So then Dean and Tanya gave their personal testimony and demonstrated that what the early Anabaptists believed and died for is relevant in the 20th century. That happened during the 1900s. And then he made an appeal to 21st century Anabaptists, a call for two-kingdom living. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, remember this, he gave a warning, and this is based on Matthew 28, like the Great Commission, go into all the world, and lo, I will be with you always. And he said, no go, no lo. Don't go, he won't be with you. I thought that was an interesting thing to remember. So here's from the booklet by Harold S. Bender. He said that there were three things that the Anabaptist vision, like 3 points of emphasis. First, a new conception of the essence of Christianity as discipleship. Second, a new conception of the church as a brotherhood. And third, a new ethic of love and non-resistance. And then I added this thing at the bottom. I just wanted for us to understand this, that the Anabaptist movement was a true spiritual revival. This was not this movement to create a people that wear plain clothing and are kind of out of touch with their culture and are kind of stodgy and don't ask them to articulate their faith. Just kind of watch them and see what you can learn, and maybe they'll let you join them, but you will have to make some changes in order to do that. It was not that kind of. This was this movement. It arose out of this time where the church and the state were unified, and so the whole community was all part of the church, and there was great wickedness in the church. And when true revival started changing hearts, there was spiritual fruit and changed lives, and it appealed in such a way, it was so compelling that by the hundreds, by the thousands, men and women from the local community came into the Anabaptist churches and stood for their faith even to their death. I wonder sometimes if we grasp what, let's say early Anabaptism as compared to some later Anabaptism. But the early Anabaptist, what kind of a true spiritual revival that actually was. Now, let's go into the questions. Why do we even call ourselves Anabaptists today? Now, why not just say we're Christian? I mean, aren't we all? We believe the Bible. What is it about Anabaptism that makes us call ourselves Anabaptists today, or makes it worth calling ourselves Anabaptists today? And in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. Acts tells us. Jesus said, "Follow me," 21 times it's recorded. Why not just call ourselves followers of Jesus? Or Paul said, "Be imitators of God as beloved children." Should we just be imitators of God? So I'm going to, because of time, I'm going to kind of like rush through these, but try to link. I have about 5 different reasons here, and it really should be like some reasons, because these are not like like all that the end all. But if you are wondering, why are we Anabaptists? Why do we even call ourselves Anabaptists today? One is to clarify our identity amidst the denominational confusion of the past 5 centuries. And here's what I mean here. So during the early church era, up until the time of Constantine, there were no denominations. It was just the church. Now, there were heresies, but basically it was all the church. Then with Constantine came the marriage of the church and the state, and for 1,000 years, through what we call the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, up until about the early 1500s, there was this marriage of church and state. And then came the Reformation and everything that took place there. And so as all these different reformers in their different places, like Luther in Germany, Zwingli in Switzerland, Calvin in Bern, Switzerland, Menno Simons and others in the Low Countries in Holland, as they all kind of like this Reformation kind of began to gather and like spreading like wildfire, kind of out of this came all these different ways of reforming the church. And it led to all these different denominations. And try as we might, in spite of periodic restoration movements, the church, the Big C church, has never been able to, since the Reformation, kind of bring everything together again into just one church. But there are these denominations, and I'm going to say that they are, instead of being critical, let's say that they developed from good good springs, and so Anabaptism is one of those ways in which all these different reformers worked to reestablish a biblical way of faith. Okay, another reason is to clarify our identity amidst the woke confusion of the past decade. Don't have time to go deeper into that. Another one is to acknowledge our identity as Americans from the Western world who stand apart from the elaborate systematic theologies developed by the Protestants to follow Jesus, and where we follow Jesus in radical obedience and simple faith of the first Christians in the apostolic era. So remember, I think it was Dean Taylor who quoted Conrad Grebel by saying there's basically, I believe in a simple theology where you just take the Bible and read it and understand it. Okay, and then why do we call ourselves Anabaptists? We acknowledge early Anabaptism as a restoration of the two kingdom understanding of the apostolic and early church in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And then the last, we renew the Anabaptist vision, not merely, okay, here's a main point. It's not an end in itself. We renew the Anabaptist vision not merely to extend a 16th century tradition, but to continue their vision for apostolic and early church two-kingdom living. Okay, is Anabaptism worth continuing in the 21st century? Only if it embodies two-kingdom living. What do we mean here by these two kingdoms? The doctrine of the two kingdoms. The doctrine of the two kingdoms can be summed up by saying it's about timing and it's about sight. And the rest of this session will cover this timing and sight. So timing. Did Jesus call us to follow Him now? Here's what I mean. So I have this graphical representation. The doctrine of the two kingdoms. There's the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of heaven. So the kingdoms of this world are established, and Satan rules in the kingdoms of this world. At the same time, there is the kingdom of heaven, where Jesus rules. Okay, now note that beginning in AD 30, see how they overlap. We live in this period of overlap. It gets really cruddy in this place of overlap. The kingdom of heaven has begun. That's what Jesus said. He began to teach and to preach that everywhere that the kingdom of heaven is right here among you. But we're not yet out of the kingdom of this world. So the kingdom actually started, but we're still, that's why we say we live in this world, but we're not of this world. So this is about timing, because then when there are passages like the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus said the radical things he taught about loving your enemies, about how we use our money, don't swear, that whole, everything in the Sermon on the Mount, there are those who have concluded, and by those I mean other Protestant groups and evangelical churches today, conclude that the call to live out the Sermon on the Mount is not something that can practically, realistically be done today. Therefore, Jesus meant that that is going to be the condition in the kingdom once we are removed from this earth and there is a heavenly kingdom. Like this earth is obliterated by heat, as Peter tells us, and a new Jerusalem, a new heavens and a new earth come down, and in that earth will dwell righteousness. And so the kingdom, or the Sermon on the Mount, that kind of living is reserved for that period. Whereas we understand through the doctrine of two kingdoms, we are actually in the heavenly kingdom, living out the teachings of Jesus here and now. Jesus did call us to follow him now. We sometimes call them like the hard sayings of Jesus, the hard teaching. And if you think about it, these are the things that set us apart from evangelical Christianity today. The other thing is sight. So how do we see ourselves? How we see ourselves determines how our culture sees us as a contributor to angst or as an antidote to angst. Are we a contributor or are we an antidote? So now we get to the third question: is Anabaptism the antidote for the angst of our age? So what does this word mean? By the way, you sometimes hear it by English speakers, they say angst. But those of us who grew up speaking Pennsylvania Dutch know better. But it's a word, it's a German word that has been anglicized and is used among English speakers as well, and it's a feeling of dread and anxiety or anguish, general pessimism about the current time. So think about, actually just like it happens right now, we're just like days away from our next presidential election. I mean, think about the angst of our times. Think about the polarization of our times. Think about the way in which there is absolutely almost no tolerance for one another within our culture. Think about all the wars that are being fought right as we speak. There's so make no mistake, like a culture that is demanding that. See how to say this? A culture that is demanding that every woman in this country should have the right to an abortion right up to the point of birth. Is like, that's not freedom. That is a desperate search for meaning and purpose in life. That's like one example about angst. What angst produces. There's another word. It's called Weltschmerz, and I think you get that as well. Like world pain is the literal translation, but it's about the pain that this world is experiencing in just attempting to dwell together outside of biblical truth in this world today, in the kingdom in Satan's kingdom today. So what I'm proposing is that Anabaptists are uniquely positioned to be the antidote for the angst that is in our world. In a world that is seeking for peace. There's, the smiley there, that's an Anabaptist smiley, okay? Just the right length beard. I'm quoting here from the NLT, the New Living Translation. So we will not be afraid on the day of judgment, but we can face Him, that's Jesus, we can face Him with confidence because we live like Jesus here in this world. This is the antidote for what's ailing our culture. So how do we see ourselves? I'm proposing that we too often see ourselves like, that's the American Gothic, that picture. Like how joyful does that look? Yeah. Like, are we these quaint holdovers from the 1500s? Interesting to come visit during times of peace, that is. Kind of like tolerated during times of war, like we're scavengers, or we're actually like let's see, what's the right, parasites during times of war, but during times of peace, nice to come here and buy our furniture, eat our food, and so on. But kind of quaint, good for us, but anything the culture would want to do. Is that how we see ourselves? Our culture of angst will see us the way that we see ourselves. Quaint holdovers or radical revolutionaries? In a culture that hates each other, we love our enemies. Our great challenge, I'm proposing, is within, changing the way we see ourselves. When we change the way we see ourselves, our culture will change the way they see us. Quaint holdovers or radical revolutionaries? This is the invitation that Jesus gave. Come unto me, all who labor and are heavy laden. That's the definition of angst. And I will give you rest. That's the definition of confidence. Being at peace. Loving your enemies. This is the invitation that Jesus gave to His generation. And this is our invitation to our culture of angst. This is the last slide, and I'm going to leave it up here until it needs to come down for whatever comes next. But this comes from J.C. Wenger, a Mennonite theologian, and here's what he said. It is much easier to be plain than attractive, and far easier to be quaint than to be relevant. History fairly screams that in every generation, the bulk of professing Christians are not winsome and prophetic witnesses at all. They try to get their own private ticket to heaven, then settle down to a life of ease and an easygoing conformity to the ethical and moral mores of their culture. Instead of being dynamic pickets of heaven, they lazily conform to the spirit of the age. Angst. The people about them detect little protest against selfishness and sin. Christ, through His Spirit, will be saying increasingly louder, perhaps through persecution, let the church be the church. He died in 1900, in about 1990, I believe. Probably this was written during the 70s or 80s. Let the church be the church. I'll turn the time back to is it you, Judd, or is it, okay.